Hello, according to the program, I'm Jimi Hendrix. I'm afraid Jimi Hendrix couldn't make it. Her family and Ginny herself have been struck with norovirus, so you get second string CrossRef speakers today. Wanted, an infrastructure for scholarly communication. My job, as I see it here, is to do what I typically do, which is stir up the pot and set up some conversation for later. In case you don't know me, I'm Geoffrey Bilder. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at CrossRef. And my interest in infrastructure, it comes from my, of course, heavy involvement with CrossRef and the assignment of identifiers to content, but also in my history working first as interim CTO for ORCID, and now more recently working very closely with DataSite to make sure that we are able to link data and publications ubiquitously and up as far upstream as possible. So I do a fair amount of thinking about infrastructure, and I've started to notice some troubling trends that I'd like to discuss here and that I'd like to discuss in the, after this panel. I'm going to start with an observation that Matthias made. I think a few other people made it too, which is that when we talk about infrastructure, typically what I like to do is I like to show this, which is my infrastructure slide, right? It's blank. That is, we don't see infrastructure, typically, unless it's not working, or unless it's incompatible. We don't generally think about the roads or the lights or the plumbing or the electricity until we go someplace where we can't actually use it or somehow it's broken. So at least 4 or 5 of you have traveled here to Berlin and realized that you forgot an electrical outlet adapter or something like that and have been cursing this, and that's when you become aware of just how dependent you are on this sort of invisible little plastic things that hide in the walls of all of the places that you go. Infrastructure, if it's working, remains invisible. And I'm going to take a slight departure from Matthias here because I want to talk about something, an experience that we've had with infrastructure in the past. Those of you who have seen me speak will probably recognize this slide. I usually put it up and I play a game. And I'm not going to play the entire game, but basically I'm just going to ask you, can you, just by looking at this, identify what this is? My guess is that most of you can. Most of you will look at this and say, this is a scholarly article. What's more, right? And you can do that without reading a thing on it. What's more is that you can identify individual parts of that scholarly article. I bet you can look at that and you can identify the title, you can identify the authors, you can identify affiliations, footnotes, where the journal name and issue and volume are all printed. You can do that, and you can't read a thing on that slide. Now that's kind of frightening. Did you know that you could do that until I pointed it out? Did you realize that? Now what I would do is I'd maintain that's infrastructure. That is infrastructure that we built, right, in analog space to allow researchers to very efficiently navigate print publications. Now I'll point out a few things that you can't tell from this. Can anybody tell me what language this is in without just resorting to probability? Okay, well, probably it's English, but there's no easy way to tell that. It could be in any language. Can anybody tell me what discipline it's in? It's kind of hard to do that, isn't it? Can you tell me, what institution it came from? None of this stuff can you tell from that infrastructure, all right? That infrastructure works across geographies, across disciplines, across institutions, across funders. You don't have to think about that. And if you do think about it, you realize that this mimics the way that research works. Research transcends geography, disciplines, certainly continents. I can't imagine anybody, any researcher here, who is not actively working with people at other institutions in other countries every day. And yet we have a problem because we keep building infrastructures that violate this. Now, wow, that's pretty awful. This is what happens when you export to PowerPoint. For once in my life, I'm not going to pick on publishers. Because in fact, I think publishers do a better job in this respect than just about anybody else in the scholarly communication ecosystem. Publishers have done things like invested heavily in the creation of CrossRef and ORCID, institutions that provide identifiers and don't try and restrict those identifiers to certain disciplines or geographies or anything else. They're pretty global. They transcend all of these things. Institutions have spent an awful lot of time trying to build institutionally based infrastructure, and to no great effect. I challenge you to this day to try and go and search across institutional archives effectively. It's pretty bloody hard to do that. So institutional archives, I mean, it's based on a fundamentally flawed concept, which is that researchers see their primary affiliation as being with their institution. Researchers increasingly, particularly the silverbacks of the world, are Ronin. They're not samurai. They can go anywhere they want. And their affiliation with an institution is almost entirely contingent. Basing infrastructure for tracking scholarly outputs and for tracking scholarly research at the institutional level is folly. And this leaves us with funders. And again, as I said, you'll be glad to know, publishers, I'm letting you off the hook, because my particular ire recently, and particularly since I worked with ORCID and went around to funders and talked to them about investing in this fundamental infrastructure that would help research work so much more effectively, I discovered something. And that is that funders think they don't fund infrastructure. Some of them are quite proud of saying that they don't fund infrastructure. They're lying. They're funding infrastructure all the time. They're just doing it poorly, and they're doing it temporarily. The number of times that I've gone to events, conferences, where top researchers are brought together under the behest of a particular funder to talk about the future of scholarly communication, in which we're going to have nano publications and we're going to have spinning PDFs, or not PDFs, anything but PDFs. And it's all going to be hyperlinked and semantically linked. Almost inevitably, those conversations start descending into the mundane. People say, yes, we want this, but we've got problems. We still can't assign identifiers to things. We still can't find storage for things. We can't assign metadata to things. Inevitably, these grand visions come down to an absence of infrastructure that they can reliably go to without thinking, without having to plan ahead for it, and without having to build themselves. But time and time again, researchers are put in a position where they're given funding, and they're told to go out and build something, and they end up building identifier schemes and storage systems and metadata systems, and then, at the end of it, it all disappears because the grant disappears. Now think about this. Think about if we funded physical infrastructure, lights, plumbing, and so on and so forth, on a grant cycle, where every 4 years, when you hit that, inevitably it's the last work package, right, sustainability, you got there and you didn't get your grant money, and it all went away. Your lights went out. This would not be an infrastructure that you'd be comfortable trusting things in. This would not be an infrastructure that you'd feel comfortable building on. This is temporary infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's all too common. One of the things that worries me in this situation is that everybody's strapped for funding. And so one of the things that a lot of agencies are doing, a lot of funders are doing, is they're looking for these public-private partnerships. And in other cases, a lot of private organizations are looking at this and saying, wow, there's a gap. Clearly, infrastructure is not being funded for research. Maybe we can do something here. And so one of the things that I worry about, in addition to the fact that we keep creating infrastructure that's focused on disciplines or countries or anything. Incidentally, I mean, not to pick on something, but when I see a phrase like European, science cloud, open science cloud, I worry, because at least 3 of those words shouldn't be there for true infrastructure. It shouldn't just be European. It shouldn't just be science. And as anybody will tell you, the cloud is just somebody else's computers. These things worry me. The other thing that worries me is that in this pinch, right, funders are trying to establish these public-private partnerships without thinking specifically about what can be in the private sphere and what should be run and controlled by the community. And by the community, I mean the broad community, the stakeholders, whether it's publishers, researchers, libraries, institutions, funders. All of them have a stake in this, and all of them should have some mechanism for ensuring that data and content that is essential to the entire process is controlled by stakeholders and by governance structure that represents that. And increasingly, I worry that we're going to enter a phase where we have effectively the Facebook of scholarship, a closed system. And then anybody's efforts that were out there to open data or open content or whatever is going to be undermined, because effectively it's not going to matter if the mechanism to access that has been totally enclosed. So this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face with restricted funding in the future. Thank you.